The morning sun cast long shadows across the military academy's courtyard as Sarah Mitchell stood in formation with her fellow cadets. Her auburn hair, carefully braided and pinned according to regulation, caught the light as she maintained perfect posture. At 19, she had dreamed of this moment for years, finally earning her place among the elite ranks of the National Defense Academy. General Harrison walked slowly down the line, his weathered face stern and unforgiving. His reputation preceded him, a decorated war veteran known for his iron discipline and zero tolerance for any deviation from military standards. The cadets had heard whispered stories about his harsh punishments, but none had experienced his wrath firsthand. Sarah's heart raced as the general paused in front of her. She had followed every regulation to the letter, studied harder than anyone else, and maintained the highest academic standard in her class. Her family had sacrificed everything to support her military dreams. Her father, a humble mechanic, had worked double shifts to afford her preparatory courses. Her mother had sewn her first uniform by hand when they couldn't afford a new one. Cadet Mitchell, General Harrison's voice cut through the morning air like a blade, stepped forward. Confusion flickered across Sarah's face, but she obeyed immediately. Around her, the other cadets remained frozen in position, their eyes locked straight ahead. The general circled her slowly, his inspection methodical and intimidating. "Your hair," he said finally, his voice dripping with disdain. "It's exactly 1/4 inch longer than regulation allows." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She had measured it herself that morning, following the same routine she had practiced for months. The difference, if it existed at all, would be barely visible to the naked eye. But she knew better than to argue with the general. "I have zero tolerance for cadets who think they can bend the rules," General Harrison continued, his voice rising so that every cadet in the courtyard could hear. "You want to be a soldier? Then you learn that discipline starts with the smallest details." Without warning, he pulled out a pair of military-grade scissors from his belt. The metal gleamed in the sunlight as he grabbed a handful of Sarah's carefully maintained hair. The other cadets watched in horror as he began cutting, his movements rough and merciless. Chunks of auburn hair fell to the ground like autumn leaves. Sarah stood perfectly still, her jaw clenched tight to prevent any sound from escaping. Tears threatened to spill from her eyes, but she forced them back. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. The general continued his savage work, cutting away months of growth in mere minutes. What had once been a beautiful regulation braid became an uneven, choppy mess. He cut so close to her scalp in some places that small nicks appeared on her skin. "Let this be a lesson to all of you," General Harrison announced to the assembled cadets. "Perfection is not optional. It is required. Any deviation from our standards will be met with swift correction." When he finally finished, Sarah looked like she had survived a battlefield rather than a routine inspection. Her hair stuck out at odd angles, some sections mere stubble, while others hung in jagged pieces. The beautiful young woman who had stood proudly in formation just minutes earlier was now a shell of her former self. The general stepped back to admire his handiwork, a cruel smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "There," he said with satisfaction. "Now you look like a proper soldier." But as Sarah raised her head to meet his gaze, something unexpected happened. A small, silver locket that had been hidden beneath her hair tumbled free, catching the morning light. The chain had been severed by his careless cutting, and the precious piece of jewelry now lay among the scattered locks of hair at her feet. General Harrison's eyes fixed on the locket, and, for the first time that morning, his confident expression wavered. He bent down slowly, his hands trembling slightly as he picked up the small silver pendant. When he opened it, his face went completely white. Inside the locket was a photograph of a young soldier in dress uniform, smiling proudly at the camera. But it wasn't just any soldier. It was Lieutenant David Harrison, the general's own son, who had died in combat 3 years earlier while serving his country with honor. The general's hands shook as he stared at the photograph. He looked up at Sarah with new eyes, seeing for the first time the resemblance he had somehow missed before. She had the same determined set to her jaw, the same fearless look in her eyes that his son had possessed. "Where did you get this?" he whispered, his voice no longer commanding, but broken and confused. Sarah's voice was steady despite her ordeal. "Lieutenant Harrison saved my brother's life in Afghanistan. My brother was badly wounded, and Lieutenant Harrison carried him to safety under heavy fire. He didn't make out himself, but he made sure my brother did. Before he died, he gave my brother this locket and asked him to find his family. My brother never forgot his debt." The courtyard fell silent, except for the sound of wind rustling through the fallen hair at Sarah's feet. General Harrison continued to stare at the photograph, his rigid military bearing crumbling with each passing second. "Your brother," he managed to say. "What was his name?" "Sergeant Michael Mitchell. He was part of the 82nd Airborne, same unit as your son. He told me stories about Lieutenant Harrison, how brave he was, how he never left anyone behind. He said your son was the finest soldier he ever served with." The weight of realization crashed down on General Harrison like a collapsing building. He had just humiliated and degraded the sister of the young man his son had died to save. The girl standing before him was connected to his beloved David in the most profound way possible. She was family to someone his son had considered worth dying for. Around them, the other cadets maintained their rigid positions, but confusion and concern were visible in their eyes. They had never seen their commanding officer display any emotion other than stern authority. The sight of General Harrison holding the locket with shaking hands was unprecedented. Sarah watched as the general struggled with his emotions. Despite what he had just done to her, she felt a wave of compassion for the broken man before her. She could see the pain in his eyes, the same pain her own family had carried when they thought they might lose her brother. "Sir," she said quietly, "my brother wanted your family to know that Lieutenant Harrison talked about you constantly. He was so proud to be your son. He said you taught him everything about being a soldier and a man." General Harrison's eyes filled with tears he had held back for 3 long years. Since his son's death, he had thrown himself into his military duties with renewed harshness, believing that only through absolute discipline could he honor David's memory. But now, faced with this young woman whose family owed their wholeness to his son's sacrifice, he realized how far he had strayed from the values David had truly represented. The locket seemed to burn in his palm as he looked at Sarah's butchered hair and the small cuts on her scalp where his scissors had been too aggressive. He had acted like a tyrant rather than the leader his son would have wanted him to be. David had died protecting others, showing compassion and courage in his final moments. How would he feel knowing his father had used his position to humiliate someone connected to the very person he had saved? General Harrison began, but the words caught in his throat. For the first time in his military career, he was completely at a loss. No training had prepared him for this moment, for the crushing weight of recognizing his own cruelty in the face of such an unexpected connection. Sarah remained at attention, her destroyed hair stirring in the morning breeze. She waited patiently as the general wrestled with his conscience, understanding that this moment was about much more than a simple haircut or military discipline. This was about a father's grief, a hero's legacy, and the invisible bonds that connect us all in ways we never expect. The silence stretched across the academy courtyard like a taut wire ready to snap. General Harrison clutched the silver locket so tightly that his knuckles turned white, the metal edges pressing deep into his palm. Around them, nearly 200 cadets maintained their rigid formation, sensing that something monumental was happening, but unable to comprehend its full meaning. Sarah Mitchell stood perfectly still, her ruined hair a stark reminder of what had just transpired. Dried blood from the small nicks on her scalp had begun to darken in the morning sun, yet her posture remained unwavering, her eyes focused straight ahead with military precision. She had been raised to respect authority, even when that authority wounded her. "Dismissed," General Harrison finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. When the cadets hesitated, uncertain whether they had heard correctly, he roared with sudden fury. "Dismissed." All of you, return to your barracks immediately." The courtyard erupted into motion as nearly 200 young people marched away in perfect formation. Their curious glances backward were quickly corrected by upperclassmen who understood the importance of following orders without question. Within minutes, only Sarah and the general remained in the vast space, surrounded by the scattered remnants of her auburn hair. General Harrison looked down at the locket again, tracing his finger over his son's young face. David had been just 22 when he died, the same age as many of the cadets under the general's command. How had he failed to see that these young people deserved the same respect and compassion that David had shown to his fellow soldiers? "Cadet Mitchell," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Please sit down." Sarah glanced around nervously. There were no chairs in the courtyard, only the concrete steps leading to the administration building. To sit during a formal interaction with a superior officer violated every protocol she had learned. "Sir, I prefer to remain standing," she replied. "That wasn't a suggestion, Cadet. It was an order." But this time, the general's tone carried no menace. Instead, it held something Sarah had never heard from him before: genuine concern. She moved carefully to the steps and sat down, her back still straight despite the informal posture. General Harrison sat beside her, the action so unprecedented that Sarah wondered if she was dreaming. In all her months at the academy, she had never seen the general sit anywhere except behind his imposing desk. "Tell me about your brother," he said quietly. "Tell me about what my son did for him." Sarah took a deep breath, organizing her thoughts. This was not the conversation she had expected when she woke up that morning. Michael was on patrol outside Kandahar when his unit was ambushed. An improvised explosive device hit their convoy, and Michael was trapped under the wreckage of their vehicle. Both of his legs were badly broken, and he was losing blood fast. The general listened intently, his eyes never leaving the photograph in the locket. Lieutenant Harrison was with a different unit that responded to the distress call. When they arrived, the area was still under heavy fire from Taliban fighters positioned in the surrounding hills. Most of the rescue team took cover, waiting for air support to clear the enemy positions. Sarah paused, remembering the way her brother had told this story with tears in his eyes. "But your son didn't wait." Michael said he crawled right through the gunfire, completely exposed, to reach the wreckage. He spent almost 20 minutes digging Michael out with his bare hands while bullets hit the ground all around him. General Harrison's breathing became labored as he imagined his son in those final moments. When Lieutenant Harrison finally freed Michael, he had to carry him nearly half a mile to the evacuation point. Michael was unconscious by then, so he never saw how badly your son was injured. A sniper had hit Lieutenant Harrison in the shoulder, but he never stopped moving. He kept saying, "We don't leave anyone behind. We don't leave anyone behind." The general's hand went to his own shoulder, as if feeling his son's pain. Michael only learned later that Lieutenant Harrison had been hit again during the evacuation. The second shot was fatal, but he still managed to get Michael to safety before he collapsed. The medics said Lieutenant Harrison could have saved himself if he had stayed behind cover, but he chose to save my brother instead. Tears flowed freely down General Harrison's weathered cheeks now. He made no attempt to hide them or maintain his commanding facade. Before the medics took Lieutenant Harrison away, he was barely conscious, but he pressed this locket into Michael's hand. He said, "Find my father. Tell him I was proud to be his son." Michael never forgot those words. Sarah reached in her pocket and pulled out a worn letter. "Michael wrote this for you 3 years ago, but he never had the courage to send it. When he heard I was coming to the academy, he asked me to carry it. He said if anything ever happened to him, someone in your family should know the truth about your son's heroism." General Harrison's hands trembled as he accepted the letter. His son's name was written on the envelope in careful block letters, "For the family of Lieutenant David Harrison, hero." "Michael wanted you to know that Lieutenant Harrison didn't just save his life," Sarah continued. "He saved our entire family." Michael came home, recovered from his injuries, and married his girlfriend. They have 2 children now, twins. Your son is their godfather. even though they never met him. We named one of them David. The general's composure finally shattered completely. 3 years of suppressed grief, anger, and guilt poured out in wrenching sobs that echoed across the empty courtyard. Sarah sat quietly beside him, offering the presence of someone who understood loss and sacrifice. "I've been so angry," he whispered between sobs. "So angry that David died while others lived. I blamed everyone, the military, the government, the cadets who reminded me of him. I've been taking my pain out on kids who just want to serve their country, the same way David did." Sarah chose her words carefully. "Sir, my brother told me that Lieutenant Harrison used to say that the hardest part of being a leader wasn't making difficult decisions. It was living with the consequences while still finding the strength to keep leading." General Harrison looked at her with new respect. Despite her youth and the trauma he had just inflicted upon her, she possessed a wisdom that came from genuine understanding of military life and sacrifice. "He said that?" the general asked. "Yes, sir. Michael said your son talked about you constantly. He said you taught him that a true leader protects those under his command, even when it costs him everything." The irony was not lost on General Harrison. He had spent 3 years believing he was honoring his son's memory through harsh discipline and unforgiving standards. In reality, he had been betraying everything David had stood for. His son had died protecting others, showing compassion and courage in impossible circumstances. Meanwhile, his father had been using his position to intimidate and humiliate young people who deserve guidance and mentorship. "Cadet Mitchell," he said, struggling to regain his composure, "what I did to you today was inexcusable. There was nothing wrong with your appearance. I was looking for a reason to assert my authority, to make an example of someone. I chose you because—" He paused, the truth painful to admit. "I chose you because you reminded me of David. The same determination, the same pride in serving. It made me angry because it reminded me of what I lost." Sarah turned to face him fully for the first time since the ordeal began. "Sir, may I speak freely?" General Harrison nodded. "I think your son would want you to see that determination and pride is a gift, not a burden. Every cadet here chose to serve knowing the risks. We're here because people like Lieutenant Harrison showed us what real courage looks like." Her words hit him like physical blows. She was right, and he knew it. David would be ashamed of what his father had become. The harsh, cruel man who had cut off a young woman's hair in a fit of petty tyranny bore no resemblance to the leader who had raised a hero. "I want to make this right," General Harrison said finally. "But I don't know how." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, considering his words. Around them, the academy continued its daily routine. Distant sounds of marching cadets and shouted commands drifted across the courtyard, reminders that life moved forward despite personal revelations and emotional breakthroughs. "My brother always said that the best leaders are the ones who can admit their mistakes and learn from them," she said carefully. He said Lieutenant Harrison told him that courage isn't about never being afraid or never being wrong. It's about facing the truth and doing better. General Harrison looked at the ruins of Sarah's hair and felt a fresh wave of shame wash over him. How could he possibly make amends for such a public humiliation? How could he undo the damage he had caused, not just to Sarah, but to his own reputation and the respect of every cadet under his command? But as he looked into Sarah's eyes, he saw something that surprised him. There was no hatred there, no desire for revenge. Instead, he saw the same quality that David had possessed, the ability to see beyond immediate pain to larger possibilities. "What would you have me do, cadet?" he asked, genuinely seeking her guidance. Sarah's response would change everything, though neither of them could imagine how profoundly in that moment. Sarah Mitchell looked across the courtyard where her hair still lay scattered like fallen leaves. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting shorter shadows and warming the concrete steps where she sat beside General Harrison. The man who had seemed like an unstoppable force just an hour earlier now appeared smaller, more human, broken by the weight of unexpected truth. "Sir," Sarah began slowly, her voice measured and thoughtful. "I think the question isn't what I want you to do. The question is what Lieutenant Harrison would want you to do." General Harrison's grip on the locket tightened. David always believed in second chances. Even as a child, he was the one defending kids who made mistakes, standing up for anyone who was being treated unfairly. "Then, maybe," Sarah said carefully, "this is your second chance." The general studied her face, searching for any sign of manipulation or hidden agenda. But Sarah's expression held only genuine sincerity. She had every right to be angry, to demand his resignation, to file complaints that would end his career. Instead, she was offering him an opportunity for redemption. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," he said quietly. "This isn't about what you deserve, sir. It's about what you choose to do next." Before General Harrison could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed across the courtyard. Major Patricia Collins, the Academy's second in command, appeared at the top of the administration building steps. Her face was a mask of barely controlled concern as she took in the scene before her. The general sitting casually beside a cadet whose hair looked like it had been attacked with garden shears. "Sir," Major Collins said carefully, her military bearing perfect despite the unusual circumstances. "I received reports of an incident during morning inspection." General Harrison rose slowly, his joints stiff from emotional exhaustion. Sarah immediately snapped to attention beside him, her military training overriding the informal conversation they had just shared. "Major Collins," the general said, his voice gaining strength, "please escort Cadet Mitchell to the infirmary. She has some minor injuries that need attention." "Sir, I'm fine," Sarah protested automatically. "That was an order, Cadet." But, again, his tone held no harshness. "After the infirmary, report to my office at 1400 hours. Major Collins's eyes widened slightly. In her 15 years at the Academy, she had never known General Harrison to schedule private meetings with cadets, especially not those involved in disciplinary incidents. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, snapping a crisp salute. As Major Collins led Sarah away, the general remained alone in the courtyard with his thoughts and the scattered remnants of his cruel act. He bent down and began gathering the fallen hair, each strand a reminder of how far he had fallen from the leader his son would have respected. Word of the morning's events spread through the Academy like wildfire, though the details became increasingly distorted with each telling. Some cadets claimed that Cadet Mitchell had been caught with contraband and punished accordingly. Others whispered that she had challenged the general's authority and suffered the consequences. The truth was far stranger than any of the rumors. In the infirmary, Major Collins watched quietly as the medic cleaned the small cuts on Sarah's scalp. The older woman had served under General Harrison for years, watching him transform from a respected leader into something harder and more bitter after his son's death. She had submitted numerous reports expressing concern about his increasingly harsh treatment of the cadets, but her recommendations had been ignored by higher command. "Cadet Mitchell," Major Collins said once the medic finished his work, "I need you to tell me exactly what happened this morning." Sarah hesitated. Military protocol demanded complete honesty with superior officers, but she also understood the larger implications of her answer. If she reported the incident as a case of abuse of power, General Harrison's career would be over. The man who had shown her unexpected vulnerability and genuine remorse would face court-martial and disgrace. "The general was conducting a routine inspection," Sarah said carefully. "He found my hair to be slightly out of regulation and corrected the issue." Major Collins's eyebrows rose. "Cadet, I've seen military haircuts. What happened to you was not a regulation correction." Sarah met the major's gaze steadily. "Ma'am, I believe the general was thorough in his correction. Sometimes leaders have to make difficult decisions to maintain standards." The major studied Sarah's face for a long moment, recognizing both the lie and the loyalty behind it. In her years of service, she had seen many acts of courage, but protecting a superior who had wronged you required a special kind of bravery. "Very well," Major Collins said finally. "But if you change your mind about what happened, my door is always open." Meanwhile, General Harrison sat in his office, staring at the letter from Sarah's brother. He had read it 3 times, each reading revealing new depths of his son's character and his own failures as a leader. Michael Mitchell's words painted a picture of Lieutenant David Harrison as a young man who embodied everything the military claimed to represent: honor, courage, compassion, and sacrifice. But more than that, the letter revealed how David had spoken about his father. He had told Michael about growing up in a military family, about learning values of integrity and service from a man he deeply admired. David had been proud to follow in his father's footsteps, believing he was living up to an example of principled leadership. The general's intercom buzzed. "Sir, you have a call from Colonel Matthews at Pentagon personnel." General Harrison's blood ran cold. Colonel Matthews only called when there were serious problems, typically involving misconduct allegations or disciplinary reviews. Had word of the morning's incident already reached Washington? "Put him through," the general said, steeling himself for what might be a career-ending conversation. "Harrison," came the colonel's familiar voice through the speaker. "I'm calling about the Mitchell file." The general's heart stopped. "Sir, Cadet Sarah Mitchell. Her brother Michael has been recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross for actions in Afghanistan. The recommendation includes detailed accounts of Lieutenant David Harrison's heroic actions. I understand your son died, saving Mitchell's life." General Harrison struggled to find his voice. "Yes, sir. That's correct. The Pentagon wants to present both awards simultaneously: the Distinguished Service Cross to Sergeant Mitchell and a posthumous Medal of Honor to Lieutenant Harrison. It would be a powerful ceremony, showing how acts of courage create lasting bonds between military families." The irony was overwhelming. At the very moment when his son was being recognized for the highest acts of military virtue, General Harrison had been demonstrating the lowest. The medal ceremony would bring national attention to David's heroism and, by extension, to his father's leadership of the academy. "Sir," General Harrison said slowly, "there's something you need to know about the Mitchell family's connection to this academy." He spent the next 20 minutes explaining everything: Sarah's presence at the academy, the morning's incident, and the devastating revelation about his son's locket. Colonel Matthews listened in complete silence, occasionally asking for clarification, but offering no judgment. When General Harrison finished, the line was quiet for a long time. "General," Colonel Matthews said finally, "this is either the worst coincidence in military history, or something bigger than both of us is at work here. Sir, I've been worried about you since David's death. Your performance reviews have shown increasing severity, and there have been informal complaints about your treatment of cadets. I was actually calling to discuss a possible reassignment." General Harrison closed his eyes, accepting that his career was probably over. He had destroyed his reputation, humiliated a young woman connected to his son's greatest moment, and violated every principle David had died defending. But Colonel Matthews continued, "Sometimes the universe provides opportunities for redemption we never expected. The question is what you're going to do with this opportunity." "I'm not sure I understand, sir." "General, your son died protecting Sergeant Mitchell. Now his sister is under your command, and you have a chance to mentor and guide her the way David would have wanted. You can honor your son's memory by becoming the leader he believed his father to be." The weight of possibility settled over General Harrison like a heavy blanket. Colonel Matthews was right. This was indeed an opportunity for redemption. But it would require him to fundamentally change everything about how he led, how he treated the cadets under his command, and how he honored his son's legacy. "The medal ceremony is scheduled for next month," Colonel Matthews continued. "Both families will be present, along with senior Pentagon leadership and media coverage. This could be a powerful moment of healing and honor, or it could become a scandal if the wrong details emerge." General Harrison understood the implicit message. He had 1 month to transform himself from the harsh tyrant he had become into a leader worthy of his son's memory. The ceremony would be his test, and Sarah Mitchell would be watching to see if his remorse translated into genuine change. "Understand, sir, the general said. "I won't disappoint you. Don't worry about disappointing me, Harrison. Worry about disappointing your son." After the call ended, General Harrison sat alone in his office, surrounded by the symbols of a distinguished military career that suddenly felt hollow and meaningless. Awards, commendations, and photographs lined the walls, but they all belonged to the man he had been before grief and anger consumed him. At exactly 1400 hours, there was a knock on his door. Sarah Mitchell stood in the doorway, her posture perfect despite the bandages visible on her scalp and the uneven stubble where her hair had been. "Cadet Mitchell reporting as ordered, sir." For the first time in 3 years, General Harrison looked at a young cadet and saw not a reminder of his loss, but an opportunity for redemption. The real test of his character was about to begin. General Harrison gestured for Sarah to sit in one of the chairs facing his desk, the same chairs where countless cadets had received reprimands, disciplinary actions, and career-ending decisions over the years. But today, the atmosphere felt different. The office that had once seemed like a courtroom now felt more like a sanctuary where two people could speak honestly about impossible circumstances. "Cadet Mitchell," the general began, then stopped and shook his head. "Sarah, may I call you Sarah?" The use of her first name was so unexpected that Sarah hesitated before responding. "Of course, sir. I just spoke with Colonel Matthews at the Pentagon. Your brother is receiving the Distinguished Service Cross, and David, my son, is being awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. The ceremony will be held here at the Academy next month." Sarah's face showed a mixture of pride and concern. She understood the significance of both awards, but she also recognized the complex emotions such a ceremony would evoke for the general. "Sir, Michael will be honored beyond words. He's never stopped feeling that he owed Lieutenant Harrison a debt he could never repay." "There is no debt," General Harrison said firmly. "David did what any good soldier would do, what any son of mine should do." He paused, the weight of his next words heavy on his tongue. "But I haven't been living up to the example he set." Sarah remained quiet, sensing that the general needed to work through his thoughts without interruption. "For 3 years, I've been angry. Angry at the war, angry at the circumstances that took my son, angry at young people like you who remind me of everything I lost. I convinced myself that harsh discipline and impossible standards were ways of honoring David's memory." The general stood and walked to the window overlooking the academy grounds. Below, cadets moved in precise formations, their lives governed by routines and regulations designed to forge them into military leaders. But David didn't die for regulations or formations or perfect haircuts. He died because he believed in protecting others, in putting service above self. And I've been doing the exact opposite. Sarah watched his reflection in the window glass, seeing the internal struggle playing out across his features. "Sir, if I may," Sarah said carefully, "my brother told me that Lieutenant Harrison used to say that grief makes people do things they never thought they would do. He said the measure of a person isn't whether they make mistakes, but whether they learn from them." General Harrison turned back to face her. "And what do you think I should learn from this morning's mistake?" "I think," Sarah said, choosing her words with precision, "that Lieutenant Harrison would want you to remember why you became a soldier in the first place. Not for the power or the authority, but to serve something bigger than yourself." The general returned to his chair, studying Sarah's face. Despite her youth and the trauma he had inflicted, she possessed a maturity that reminded him powerfully of David. The same thoughtfulness, the same ability to see beyond immediate circumstances to larger truths. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Do you want to stay at this academy?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah could easily request a transfer to another institution, citing the morning's incident as justification. Any reasonable person would want to escape the command of someone who had publicly humiliated them. "Sir, I came here to become the best officer I can be. If you're asking whether I trust you to help me achieve that goal." She paused, considering her words carefully. "I think the man who raised Lieutenant Harrison is still in there somewhere. And I think that man could be an excellent teacher if he remembers what he's supposed to be teaching. General Harrison felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the tight knot of anger and grief that had governed his actions for so long. This young woman was offering him not just forgiveness, but faith in his potential for redemption. "There's going to be a formal investigation," he said quietly. "What happened this morning violated several regulations. Major Collins has already filed a preliminary report." Sarah's expression remained calm. "What did you tell her to include in that report, sir?" "The truth. That I allowed personal emotions to cloud my judgment and acted inappropriately toward a cadet under my command. And what will happen to you?" General Harrison had been wrestling with that question since his conversation with Colonel Matthews. In all likelihood, he would face disciplinary action, possibly removal from command, certainly a permanent mark on his service record. "I don't know," he admitted, "but whatever the consequences, I deserve them." Sarah leaned forward in her chair. "Sir, may I make a suggestion?" He nodded. "Don't focus on what you deserve. Focus on what you can contribute. The Academy has 200 cadets who need strong leadership. Lieutenant Harrison's memory deserved better than a father who destroys his career in a fit of guilt. And the military needs officers who understand how to lead with both strength and compassion." Her words struck him like physical blows, but they were blows that healed rather than wounded. She was right, of course. Self-destruction would not honor David's memory or help anyone else. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that you become the leader Lieutenant Harrison believed his father to be. Not the harsh taskmaster you've been, but someone who inspires others to be their best selves." General Harrison was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the profound challenge she had just issued. It would be easier to resign in disgrace than to undertake the hard work of genuine change. But easier had never been David's way, and it shouldn't be his either. "There's something else," the general said. "The Pentagon wants to make the medal ceremony a major event. National media coverage, senior leadership from all branches. It's going to bring a lot of attention to the Academy and to our family story." Sarah understood the implications immediately. Any hint of the morning's incident would create a scandal that would overshadow both men's heroic service. The story would become about abuse of power rather than courage and sacrifice. "What do you need from me?" she asked simply. "I need you to trust me to do better. And I need you to help me figure out how to become the leader this Academy needs." Sarah was quiet for several minutes, weighing the enormity of what he was asking. He wanted her to become not just a cadet under his command, but a partner in his personal transformation. It was an unprecedented request that violated normal military hierarchies and protocols. "Sir, if we're going to do this, there need to be ground rules, such as you have to commit to changing how you treat all the cadets, not just me. What happened this morning happens to other people in different ways. The fear, the intimidation, the impossible standards designed to break people down rather than build them up." General Harrison winced at the accurate assessment of his recent leadership style. "You're right. It has to change completely, and you have to trust the process. There will be days when you want to fall back into old patterns, when kindness feels like weakness and compassion feels like failure. You have to trust that Lieutenant Harrison's way was the right way." "Anything else?" Sarah hesitated, then forged ahead with the most difficult request. "You have to forgive yourself, not because you deserve it, but because guilt and self-hatred make terrible foundations for leadership. Lieutenant Harrison wouldn't want his father to spend the rest of his career punishing himself." General Harrison felt tears threatening again, but this time they were tears of possibility rather than despair. This remarkable young woman was offering him a path back to the man he had once been, the man David had believed his father to be. "How do we start?" he asked. "We start by calling in Major Collins and telling her the truth about what we're trying to accomplish. She's been watching your leadership deteriorate for 3 years. If anyone will support genuine change, it's her." As Sarah spoke, General Harrison realized that his son's sacrifice had brought him more than just a connection to the Mitchell family. It had brought him a teacher, a guide who could help him navigate the difficult journey from harsh taskmaster to inspirational leader. The road ahead would not be easy, and there would be many opportunities to fail. But for the first time since David's death, General Harrison felt something he had almost forgotten: hope for redemption and the possibility of becoming worthy of his son's memory. Outside his office window, the academy continued its daily routine, unaware that everything was about to change. The transformation would begin with a single conversation with Major Collins, but it would require months of sustained effort to rebuild trust, establish new patterns of leadership, and prepare for a medal ceremony that would test everything they hoped to accomplish. The real work was just beginning. 3 weeks later, the transformation at the academy was subtle but unmistakable. Cadets who had once moved through the halls with tense shoulders and downcast eyes now walked with confident purpose. Morning inspections, while still rigorous, had become opportunities for guidance rather than humiliation. The harsh bark of commands had been replaced by firm but respectful instruction. Major Collins stood beside General Harrison as they watched the evening formation from his office window. The change in his leadership style had been dramatic, but she remained cautiously optimistic. 30 years in the military had taught her that people could sustain false transformations for weeks or even months before reverting to their true nature. The cadets are responding well, she observed carefully. They're responding to consistency, General Harrison replied. For 3 years, they never knew which version of me they would encounter. Anger is exhausting for everyone involved. Sarah Mitchell's hair had grown back just enough to be styled into a regulation cut, though it would be months before it returned to its original length. More importantly, her relationship with the general had evolved into something unprecedented in Academy history, a mentorship that transcended traditional military hierarchy while maintaining proper respect for rank and protocol. She now met with General Harrison twice weekly, ostensibly for advanced leadership training, but actually to help him process the challenges of changing decades-old patterns of behavior. Their conversations had become a source of strength for both of them. Tomorrow is the big day, Major Collins said, referring to the medal ceremony that had consumed weeks of preparation. General Harrison nodded, feeling a familiar tightness in his chest. Michael Mitchell had arrived that morning with his wife and twin children, little David and Emma, now 3 years old. Seeing the man his son had died to save, watching him play with children who existed because of David's sacrifice, had been almost overwhelming. The Pentagon had spared no expense for the ceremony. A temporary stage had been constructed in the main courtyard, complete with military band, honor guard, and seating for over 500 guests. Media representatives from major networks had set up cameras and equipment ready to broadcast what was being promoted as a story of heroism, sacrifice, and the enduring bonds between military families. What none of them knew was the deeper story of redemption and transformation that had grown from tragedy. A knock on the door interrupted their thoughts. Sarah entered, followed by a distinguished man in dress uniform whom General Harrison immediately recognized from photographs. Sergeant Major Michael Mitchell, the man his son had saved. "Sir," Sarah said formally, "I'd like you to meet my brother Michael." The two men faced each other across the office, each carrying the weight of their shared connection. Michael Mitchell was shorter than the general had imagined, but his bearing spoke of quiet strength and unshakable integrity. His left leg showed a slight limp from his injuries, a permanent reminder of the day that had changed both their lives. "General Harrison," Michael said, extending his hand, "I've been waiting 3 years to thank you for raising such an extraordinary son." The general gripped Michael's hand tightly, finding his voice with difficulty. "Your presence here is thanks enough. David will be proud to see what you've accomplished." "Sir, if I may," Michael said, his voice thick with emotion, "I've carried guilt for 3 years about surviving when Lieutenant Harrison didn't. Sarah told me about your conversation, about how you've been struggling with similar feelings. I wanted you to know that your son talked about you constantly during our deployment." General Harrison gestured for everyone to sit, sensing that this conversation would require time and privacy. He told us stories about growing up on military bases, about learning to shoot and fish, and came from a father who made time for him despite the demands of command. He said his proudest moment was the day he earned his commission and saw the pride in your eyes. Major Collins quietly excused herself, recognizing this as a private family moment despite the lack of blood relation between the participants. David never doubted that he was living up to your example, Michael continued. He said you taught him that leadership meant taking care of people, that real strength came from protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The day he saved my life, he was just doing what you had taught him to do. General Harrison struggled to maintain his composure. For 3 years, he had tormented himself with questions about whether David's death had meaning, whether his son had truly understood the values his father had tried to instill. Michael's words provided answers he had desperately needed. He also talked about wanting to follow in your footsteps, Michael added. Not just as a career, but as a leader who inspired others to be better than they thought possible. Sarah tells me you've been working to become that kind of leader again. Sarah had been quiet during the exchange, but now she spoke up. Michael, tell him about the letter. Michael reached into his jacket and pulled out a sealed envelope, yellowed with age and wear. This was in Lieutenant Harrison's personal effects when they were returned to me. It's addressed to you, sir. I should have given it to you years ago, but I wasn't sure how to approach you. General Harrison's hands trembled as he accepted the envelope. His name was written across the front in David's familiar handwriting, and the paper showed signs of being carried in a pocket for extended periods. He carried this with him? The general asked. Every day, sir. The other soldiers used to tease him about it, calling it his insurance policy. But David said it contained everything he wanted his father to know if something happened to him. With infinite care, General Harrison opened the envelope and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. David's handwriting filled the page, clear and confident despite the challenging conditions under which it had been written. Dad, the letter began, if you're reading this, it means I didn't make it home from this deployment. I want you to know that I'm not afraid, and I don't want you to be angry. I'm doing exactly what you taught me to do, serving something bigger than myself, and taking care of the people around me. The general's vision blurred as he continued reading. I know you'll blame yourself, and wonder if you could have prepared me better or taught me something different. But you gave me everything I needed. You showed me how to be strong without being cruel, how to lead without being a tyrant, how to care about people without losing the ability to make hard decisions. Sarah and Michael sat quietly as General Harrison absorbed his son's final message. I've been thinking a lot about legacy lately, the letter continued. Not the medals or commendations, but the way we treat people and the example we set. I hope that when people remember me, they'll say I was like my father, someone who made others better just by being around them. General Harrison had a pause, overcome by the irony of reading these words after 3 years of being exactly the opposite of what David had described. I know military life isn't easy for families, and I know you've sacrificed a lot for your career and for me, but I want you to know that every sacrifice was worth it. Having you as a father made me proud to serve, proud to lead, and proud to be a Harrison. The letter concluded with words that would stay with the general for the rest of his life. If something happens to me, don't let it change who you are. Keep being the leader who inspired me. Keep caring about the people under your command, and keep making our family proud. The world needs more leaders like you, not fewer. I love you, Dad. Make sure Mom knows I was happy and that I died doing what I believed in. David. The office was silent except for the sound of the general's quiet sobs. 3 years of grief, guilt, and misplaced anger poured out as he finally heard his son's true final message. David had died believing in his father's example and hoping that legacy would continue. Sir, Sarah said gently, tomorrow the whole world is going to see what Lieutenant Harrison accomplished. But more importantly, they're going to see the man who raised him. Your son believed in the leader you could be. Now you have the chance to prove he was right. General Harrison looked up at the 3 people who had become his unexpected sources of healing. Major Collins, who had returned quietly, and now stood in the doorway. Sarah, whose forgiveness had made redemption possible, and Michael, whose presence proved that David's sacrifice had meaning beyond measure. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice stronger than it had been in years, "we honor two heroes. But more than that, we honor the idea that service and sacrifice create bonds that transcend death itself." As the sun set over the academy, General Harrison felt a peace he hadn't experienced since David's death. The medal ceremony would be a test of everything he had learned about leadership, humility, and the true meaning of his son's legacy. But for the first time in 3 years, he faced that test with confidence rather than fear. The transformation from harsh taskmaster to inspirational leader was nearly complete. Tomorrow would prove whether the change was genuine and lasting, or merely a temporary response to extraordinary circumstances. The eyes of the nation would be watching, but, more importantly, the memory of Lieutenant David Harrison would be judging whether his father had truly learned what it meant to lead with honor. The ceremony would mark not just the recognition of past heroism, but the beginning of a new chapter in which service, sacrifice, and redemption created a legacy worthy of a young man who had died protecting others. General Harrison was finally ready to become the leader his son had always believed him to be.